Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ecology, Cosmos and Consciousness Salon.
Hey!
Ahoy! So, how many people have not been here before? Oh, loads of you, fantastic. Well, welcome.
Yeah.
We run every last Tuesday of the month, more or less, not always. And it's been running for about 7 years, various themes on anything from anarchy, shamanism, magic, anthropology, parapsychology, more anarchy, bit of liberty, philosophy of mind, chaos, reality, ontology, all that kind of juicy stuff.
Disney.
Yeah, a bit Disney, but good measure. And Irving as well. And so tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different. Normally just have a speaker come in, but we're going to try and do a little bit of a dialogue between myself and Dr. Rory Mac Sweeney here. And we're going to be talking about lucid dreaming and are dreams made of atoms? And this is kind of based on Rory's fantastic new book, which is out precisely a week ago. Yeah, more or less. And so just join me in welcoming our speaker for tonight, Dr. Rory Mac Sweeney. I actually should give you a bit of an introduction. So Rory is actually just is an old chum of mine, and he's very much interested in kind of surfing the enigmas of consciousness through altered states. Primarily, his main forte is through lucid dreaming. So we're going to have a bit of a discussion about that. And so, well, let's have a discussion. Rory, tell me about your book.
Yeah, so I suppose the genesis of the question for me really comes from my own personal experience of lucid dreaming. When we look at the kind of evolution of dreaming in terms of our understanding of dreaming, we would have started with, say, in the kind of Freudian foothold where we looked at dreams retrospectively in a psychoanalytic frame. So we don't actually get to investigate dreams directly in psychoanalysis. We have a dream and then we subsequently consider what that might mean or how we can, try to engineer some sort of relationship with that. But that's a retrospective analysis of the circumstance. It's a bit like history, for example. We weren't there, we just infer it, or anthropology. So that's the kind of foothold we have in the dream world to begin with. And then as we progress through into the kind of more biological sciences, we start to look at it from the point of view of neurobiology. I see David posted out this week on this particular event here that scientists were able to provoke cells in the medulla, in the brainstem, using ontogenetics, if anybody's familiar with that, and it was able to trigger REM states or dream states in mice, and then they were able to turn the same cellular tissue off and turn the dream state off. So we can infer from that the medulla is, in terms of its biological, how would I say, its biological meaning in dreams, we can start to look at dreaming that way. So again, this is a kind of another indirect measurement of dreams. We're able to look at it in terms of time, in the actual state of dreaming, but we're still looking at the whole dream concern indirectly. So for me, the real kind of shift in this evolutionary evaluation of dreaming comes with the advent of the lucid dreamer, because what the lucid dreamer does is it gives us a new perspective on dreaming. We're not looking at it as a past event, we're looking at it as a current event, so we've already crossed that. We're not looking at it indirectly by looking at the effects of dreams or the effects of things on dreams, looking at the effect of, we'll say, various types of drugs or various effects of, stimulating or dulling down various brain organelles. On the contrary, we're looking at the dream, the way I like to describe it, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. So now we get to ask very different questions. So if we think about what the lucid dreamer represents to us in terms of our kind of scientific appraisal of dreaming, we now get to look at dreaming not just from the outside inwards, through neurobiology, through psychoanalytics, we get to look at it from the inside outwards. And that changes our paradigmatic approach to dreaming. So now we get to ask different questions, and that's kind of what the genesis of the question, which is what the book asks right there, which is, are dreams made of atoms? And that's kind of what we want to get into tonight. So we want to look at how could we model the idea of dreams being made of atoms. This is not something we've necessarily had the inclination to do historically, because we've always looked at dreams from the outside inwards. But I think we look from the inside outwards, as I said, you change the language, you change the ontological perspective. Did you want to kind of pick up on that a little bit, Sarah, saying?
Yeah, I totally do that. I mean, I guess the crux of this is, like state-specific sciences. Charles Tarbell's kind of parapsychologist, transpersonal psychologist in the 60s, and he's saying, well, science only really progresses by from one state of consciousness, i.e. the ordinary, everyday working state of consciousness, and we never really ask questions about the nature of reality based on a scientific perspective, which come from other states of consciousness. So, and he was very much kind of took the idea of a dream or a lucid dream, and you could ask questions about the nature of science and reality from within those states themselves, rather from kind of trying to objectively put the dream state somewhere out there as something you can view objectively from a sober state of mind, if you like. It's kind of looking at it from within, looking out, in a way, and then kind of questioning, well, what's the nature of reality then? And I guess you can lead to very different perspectives on the nature of reality. If you were kind of a lucid dream scientist, like my good friend here, Rory, a scientist in his lucid dreams, where he kind of asks questions about the nature of reality, well, what kind of conclusions do you come to about the nature of reality when you ask those questions from inside a lucid dream?
I suppose the obvious kind of, and I pick up the word scientist there, and I agree with David. I mean, I'm a scientist by training, hence the doctor title, but I'm a phony, I'm a dentist. So if he wants a fucking root canal, you know where to go. But taking that aside, I have also a degree in genetics and have a very scientific mind, and I really am a scientist by training and by thought and by practice. But I guess the criticism I would face as somebody who takes on the role of lucid dream scientist is that there is such a thing as lucid dream science. They're doing PhDs in lucid dreaming, and they're in laboratories studying, building various models and databases and testing and so forth. They're building their understanding of biology, they're looking at psychological models, they're starting to combine them and so on. The criticism they might make of me as a scientist in the dream world is any observation I make as somebody in the dream world, it's going to be a very subjective kind of description of things, and that's a fairly fair criticism. I'm not going to disagree with that. So in that regard, I kind of role play the explorer / scientist, and wherever you feel you want to kind of view me in that regard, feel free. I'm kind of flexible on the whole thing myself. But I do think we need to get scientific about trying to get into the dream world and ask questions in there specifically, and we need to build questions that are repeatable, that are quantitative, that can yield very specific data. So as an example of that, something I was very interested in doing in the dream state was practicing my Tai Chi form. My background outside of my kind of professional life is in martial arts and has been since I was 10 years old. So I've got a very good understanding of martial arts. I practice 30, 40 years at that stage. And Tai Chi, I wanted to practice the Tai Chi form in the lucid dream state and say, well, what would that be like? What would it do? I had no expectations as to what it would be like, but what would it be like to practice the Tai Chi form in the lucid dream state? I won't go into the details because it might kind of meander away from where I'm trying to get to, but it wasn't quite what I expected, to say the least. So that kind of then said, okay, well, what if I could just try and get something that asks the same question as that, but in a more quantitative form, in a form that anybody else could try as well, and in a form that would yield something of a numerical nature. So I asked, how many push-ups can I do in a lucid dream? And that is the thing I started to play with. I said, okay, well, I can use that because wherever you are in a lucid dream, there's always a floor. You've always got a body, more or less, and you can just literally drop on the floor and start doing push-ups. And then you can measure it, 1, 2, 3, 20, 30, infinite, whatever. So again, let's just take the kind of expectation model of reality, and we'll kind of start to play with this idea of what are dreams made of now. So if I ask somebody, what are dreams made of? Our kind of knee-jerk reaction will typically be, well, they're made of thoughts, or they're made of memories, or they're made of expectations or anxieties. They're certainly influenced by all those things in a very Freudian way. The narrative of the dream is very much influenced by memories or expectations or data residue, as Freud would have called it, things we anticipate, things we've seen today, things we're thinking about. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. But the question I'm trying to ask is, taking all that aside, I'm not concerned about the semantics and about the narrative. I'm more concerned about the fabric of the dream space itself. That's a very important term, the fabric of the dream space. What is the fabric of the dream space made of? If you took an orange in a dream and you held it in your hand, it would have texture, it would have volume in a three-dimensional way, it would have taste if you tasted it. It would have mass because you can feel the weight of the orange in your hand, and if you threw it away from yourself, it would have some kind of relationship with the environment, which is, as far as you're concerned, determined by the environment in the orange and not necessarily by you having to orchestrate it in some way. So if you took an orange in a dream, it acts in the same way, more or less, as an orange does here. So the way we start to kind of interpret that is that it's a kind of this idea of expectation is, so dreams are therefore made of expectations, and the mind somehow models them. We did some bullshit tautological essay about that. That doesn't really answer the question. Don't go there if that's your answer. You'll end up in this kind of recursive metaphors, talking yourself stupid until you realise that you actually got nowhere. So don't bother with that one. Instead, just come back to the actual first-hand experience. You're in a room, you've got an orange, you throw it, you pick it up, you squeeze it, you eat it. It does the same thing this does right here. The logical conclusion is, in some ways, it is the same thing as what's happening right here. But when I tell that to somebody, the immediate answer is, no, but it's just a dream, it's just in your head, it's just imagination. But I don't disagree, it is your imagination, but the question is, what is your imagination? It's like the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Everybody knows it's 42, but nobody knows what it means. You know? Everybody knows dreams are made of imagination, but nobody knows what that means. So that's kind of what we're trying to get at. Forget this idea of, well, dreams are made of just this or just that. Yeah, they're made of thoughts, they're made of imagination, but what are thoughts, what are imagination? But what I found as a lucid dreamer was that, I was able to go into the dream state, and still am, and just start to play with the fabric of the dream and ask, what does it feel like? Is it solid to touch? Is it temperature sensitive? Can you feel very kind of subtle dimensions of texture to it? For example, I remember once taking a leaf off a tree and tearing it, and I could feel each vein, the leaf going click, 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 click. And it wasn't that I expected it, it's just the leaf had that property to it. And I said, that's just like a real leaf on a real tree, because it is a real leaf and it is on a tree. It's just, there must be a physics to this thing. So that's the question. This is, again, just the kind of point at the genesis of the question. This is how I came to this question about, are dreams made of atoms? What I'm really asking is, are dreams woven from the same fabric as the chairs you're sitting on right now? And if they are, well, we're in big fucking trouble, aren't we? We've got ourselves in a real fucking mess. So you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. How many sit-ups? How many press-ups?
Oh yeah. Hey, there's the question. How many push-ups? I hope you're all thinking the same thing, yeah. Okay, well look, it's in the book, and this is the kind of... yeah, and by the way, don't feel free to bring the book. I'm trying to give you the meme here tonight. As I was saying to David, to me, what I'm trying to do is trying to create some momentum in the meme. And the meme's what I want to express here tonight. Whether you read the book, or you pick up in a video, or you hear it tonight, the meme is what's crucial. And the meme is basically... in that essay, it's in that push-ups experiment. I got 3 outcomes, as one would probably anticipate. On the one end of the scale, the very first time I tried it, I did a push-up and I floated off the ground, like I was on the moon, so to speak. I had a complete loss of gravity. So I did a push-up and I'm floating off the ground. I did a push-up and I'm floating off the ground. By about 4 or 5 attempts, I'm thinking, okay, this is not going to happen. Every time I do a push-up, I think they'll just bounce around like a balloon. So I kind of put it aside and went off and did some other whatever. And then I came back and did it again. I got the floaty sensation. Okay, I'm kind of thinking this is where it's going. I kind of put it aside and started getting involved with some other ideas for a while. I came back to it again. Then when I started doing the push-ups, I started getting this really bizarre opposite effect, whereby when I do the push-up, I do maybe 20, 30, and then I just could not get up anymore. I got gravity going the opposite direction, so it started pushing me against the floor. I mean, I literally could not do push-ups. So that was a really curious outcome. And I started playing with that for a while, and I got a few more mixed, so I get someone I'm too light, someone I'm too heavy, so I couldn't quite find the balance. But I figured there must be a balance. If I can get heavy and I can get light, I must be able to find a balance. And eventually, on one occasion, I did manage to get the proverbial infinite push-up. And therefore, what that says to me is there's some kind of a spectrum, and the spectrum would be that it must be interdependent on something that I'm doing, so to speak. In other words, there must be some kind of a relationship between the way the physics is operating in the dream world and something else. Now, if we take the kind of current how would I say, speculation that we have arrived at in terms of our model of physics, and I don't need to mention the Q word, but I'm going to have to. And incidentally, quantum is not a license to speak crazy, as people often use it, but at the same time, you have to talk about the elephant in the room. It's like you get a bunch of scientists who mention the word quantum, and suddenly fucking Richard Dawkins is jumping out and saying, well, you don't even know what that means. Maybe I fucking do. Maybe you don't, bozo. So what does it mean? Well, quantum, and by the way, quantum physics is not weird, as it's often said. Quantum physics is just misunderstood. We don't think we experience it, but we do, as I'll get to. It's not that big a deal. And the book gets into this. I get into the nitty-gritty of this, but I'll just give you the punchline here to try and show you where I'm trying to take this idea. So it would seem that we have, on the one hand, we have these two types of physics. We have the classic four-dimensional physics, which is what Einstein prescribes. Now, that's the kind of physics you need if you want to know how, by the way, how the fuck did I get from press-ups to this? It all comes together. Just treat it like a trip, hang on to your chair and just hope it's all going to be over soon. So anyway, so we got two types of physics. We got our four-dimensional type of physics, which is, 3 dimensions of space and one of time. And the crux of four-dimensional physics is quite simple. It's called causality. And we've all heard the word, but I'll just to kind of reiterate what it is to everybody. Causality means that in order for something to happen, there must be a prior cause to affect it into being. So if you want to have a tree, you need a seed. A seed grows into a tree. If you want to have, say, complex chemistry, you need elemental chemistry. If you want to have complex biology, you need molecular biology, and so on and so forth. So everything has a kind of a prior cause. And we can regress that prior cause, all the way across the space line is in the dimensions of space. Matter, we can reduce it into very smaller parts. And time, we can regress the universe back to the Big Bang. So if you want to know how a universe works, you need to have that kind of physics, which is basically based on causality. But if you want to bring a universe on stage in the first place, you need a different kind of physics. You need quantum physics. You need to work with black holes, baby universes. In order to bring a universe onto the stage, you need quantum. So what's fundamentally different about quantum physics, what's fundamentally different about that to Newtonian mechanics or Einstein's physics, is that you don't necessarily have causality. That's the only real big difference. They dress it up as this, that, and the other thing, but the fundamental difference is causality. In other words, you don't need necessarily to have a prior cause to have if you're working with quantum physics. So in that regard, you can get something from nothing, which is how you get the universe in the first place. The current theory says the universe came from nothing. Because once you introduce time, then you have causality, and you have a whole lot of other philosophical problems. So you need a very special kind of physics that allows you to get something from nothing. Okay? So we've got these two types of physics. We've got this quantum type physics, it's non-causal, you can get something from nothing. And then we've got the other kind of physics, which is four-dimensional, which has got a very specific kind of a motif to it, which is causality. Okay? We also have, if we look at our consciousness, we also have two very different states of consciousness. Okay? We have the one we're experiencing right now, which we're going to call self-reflective conscious awareness, the one we're all familiar with. But the thing about self-reflective conscious awareness, I'll get to that, we also have the other type of consciousness, which is, we'll say, dreaming consciousness. Now, when we're dreaming, we're conscious, but we're self-reflective to a degree. If somebody calls your name in a dream, you will turn around and answer to your name, right? So you must know who you are. You have some sense of self. If, for example, you're walking, you must have a sense of my legs, so you must have some bodily sense of self. Okay? So you have some sense of self-reflective awareness. But you don't have the cognitive insight that you have right now to say, am I dreaming? Right? So we know that that's what a lucid dream is. A lucid dream is when you say, am I dreaming? And you say to yourself, well, yes, I'm dreaming. And if I'm dreaming, you can take it from there.
We do actually have a kind of lucid awake state, so because we don't ever ask the question, am I awake? All the time. That's not part of the problem, isn't it? Not being kind of lucid, generally awake or asleep.
Well, you see, that's the thing. Again, some people take this as a kind of criticism, this lack of intellectual insight that we have in dreaming, and we kind of seem to think that it spills over into the awakened state in some ways. But my model of reality says that it's necessary. My model of reality says that we have to have a state of consciousness that is non-self-reflective, and we also have to have an opposite state which is self-reflective and narratively congruent and very aware of its story, so to speak. And likewise, we have to have a physics that's very kind of rigid and precise, but we also have to have another physics which is completely disorganized. You have to have both. And both the systems are working symbiotically. One, which is the current state of physics that we're experiencing right now, is what I would describe it as narratively congruent, which is to say that you all have a story about how and what you are. You all have that story. But that story is constantly being disrupted, it's changing direction, and it's creating new stories. So there's something that seems to be keep kind of buckling your story, so to speak. And that's the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the dream world. You see, in the dream world, the story gets disrupted. Your state of consciousness, it goes into a kind of a narratively incongruent state, which is to say that in a dream, there's no such thing as the meta story of me. There's just these kind of micro stories that go from minute to minute, or second to second, or 10 minutes to 10 minutes, and then they get disrupted into all sorts of other stories. But the meta story of me is not in the dream state. So we don't have that kind of metacognitive insight of who and what we are. In the waking state, we've got that. In the dream state, we don't. Now, if we look at our physics again, we have our four-dimensional physics on one end of the spectrum, which, as I said, has got causality. And causality means that the story is congruent from chapter to chapter to chapter. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got quantum physics. And quantum physics, I said, is non-causal. It's not necessarily got causality. So in that regard, because things aren't necessarily going from chapter to chapter, they're non-causal, they're narratively incongruent, the physics of the quantum physics, as you can see, sits with dreaming, because you don't need this kind of congruent narrative. On the other hand, classical physics, or causal physics, sits with this state of consciousness right now. So what I start to see right now is we have this kind of quantum type physics and this kind of narratively incongruent, non-self-reflective, story jumping around the place type essay of self here. And then we've got this causal kind of more rigid type of physics and more rigid type of self right here. So now what we have is we have a kind of a natural, how would I say, we have this kind of symphony of this pendulum, so to speak, that switches from the causal, narrative, four-dimensional state of consciousness, this kind of congruent sense of reality we have. It swings into this kind of quantum state where everything kind of gets jumbled up, and it swings back into this state again. But the two are influencing each other at all times. Is anybody buying this, by the way?
I don't agree. I mean, Einstein, for one, kind of supposedly came up with this idea for relativity from the dream, as did Niels Bohr got the idea for his quantum theory based on the orbiting of electrons. Both came from dreams, so
well,
maybe they were tapping into it.
Yeah, Niels Bohr certainly, what Niels Bohr was talking about was this idea of non-duality. I don't use non-duality because it's going to take us far too off. So let me get you back to the push-ups. So here's how the push-ups work. So this is what ultimately was precipitated from this theory, and once I give you the punchline, the theory will make a bit more sense. So the theory goes like this. I call the theory the double-edged self theory. Right? Double-edged, we're all familiar with that kind of metaphorical idea that something has got two implications to it, and the self being the center of this, this double-edged concern. So what I'm saying is, in essence, the more self-reflectively aware we are, the more congruent our story has to be to suit that state of consciousness, and hence, the more rigid reality starts to behave, and hence the more likely we are to encounter four-dimensional space-time causal physics. The less self-reflective we are, as in dreaming, then the more likely we are to enter into this kind of quantum-like behavior. And in the quantum state, we don't have causality. Hence, things don't have to make sense necessarily. So things can come into existence and pop out of existence as they do in quantum physics. Things can literally move around in time dimensions as they do in quantum physics, as they do in dreams and so forth. So the summary of the theory therefore comes out as this. Self-reflective awareness is inversely proportional to magical states. So when I say magical states, what I mean is shamanism, I mean yogic states, lucid dreaming, etc. In order to enter into those states, we have to dull down the sense of self. And that's precisely what we do with psychedelics. When we take psychedelics, we turn down the default mode network, and we start to enter into this kind of this kind of semi-critical, semi-self-reflective state. When we're dreaming, we normally turn the sense of self down, and hence the kind of quantum-like behavior starts to take place. When we switch it back on again, as in we do with lucid dreaming, what we find is it actually starts to move in a very peculiar way. And this is where the push-ups comes in. In a lucid dream, you can be slightly lucid, moderately lucid, or very lucid. In other words, your sense of self in the dreaming state, in the lucid dream, can be, I know I'm dreaming, but I'm kind of half buying into this story too. You can be, I know I'm dreaming, I've done a reality check, I'm certain I'm dreaming, and I'm going to experiment. Or you can be, I'm 100% I'm dreaming, I've done a reality check, I know exactly what's going on, I know what's happening, I'm in a lucid dream, I'm ready to do my thing. And what I found is when I'm at the lower end of the spectrum, is in when I'm slightly switched on, kind of lucid, my ability to perform dream magic is much higher. The more switched on I become, the more lucid I become, the more self-reflectively aware I become, the more the dream starts to get rigid. Now I find it hard to walk through walls, I find it hard to fly, I find it hard to do a lot of things I can't ordinarily do. But if I can get that middle place where I know I'm lucid dreaming, but I'm not quite switched on to the whole kind of, I'm in my bedroom and it's the 31st of August and it's 12 o'clock at night time, I know exactly where, but I'm also here. If I can kind of just loosen up that narrative slightly, then the dream magic gets quite flexible. So it's about trying to find that place in the middle. And I think likewise with the psychedelics, if you bring too much of that self-reflective kind of four-dimensional sense, that kind of everyday narrative into the experience, then it becomes a real wrestling match. But if on the other hand you kind of agree to allow your self-reflective sense of self to dissolve into the experience, then you can enter into kind of more mystical states with a lot more ease. Is that making any fucking sense?
So you're saying that the lucid dream state's a bit closer to me where I'm sitting. I'm kind of representing normal waking consciousness over here. You're saying that's in terms of what kind of magic you can get away with, that's more of a rigid state of reality.
Yeah, so really, in summary, reality is the physics of reality, let me rephrase that, physics is interdependent on the state of consciousness we're in. The more self-reflective we are, the more four-dimensional it is, the less self-reflective we are, the more quantum-like it is, and hence the more magic it is. So the key really, the crux of the whole thing is, it all hinges on self-reflective awareness. And if you look at that biologically speaking, and you turn the sense of self up, you start to change not just you change the physics. You change the physics. You turn the sense of self down, you change the physics. And that's the key. Turn the sense of self up, turn it down. It's a volume switch. And the question is, how do you do that? Well, then that goes into, psychedelics, what they point to David, we all know the truth. And dreaming and lucid dreaming, and you can start to see a spectrum unfolding.
So I know it's not the type of questions, but I just had this question about lucid dreaming, because for me, to get from dreaming in an ordinary way to having anything like a lucid dream is a huge act of self-reflection or self-awareness. Just to even get to that point where you're a little bit self-aware, aware enough to have a lucid dream. Whereas in psychedelics, it's sort of the opposite. You give yourself over to the experience and, and take what you can from it, for me.
That's exactly what my book says. My book says you approach the psychedelic state from the self-reflective state down into the non-reflective state. With lucid dreaming, you're normally not reflective, and then you progress into self-reflective. You get to the same place, but you're approaching from different ends of the same spectrum. But you can always, a very good question, seriously. You can also get into a lucid dream directly from, it's called a wake-induced lucid dream. You don't fall asleep. So you can go directly from waking into the dream state. And I can tell you, if you do that, your sense of self never quite switches off. So it stays reflective all the way. And when you do, the texture of the dream is much more rigid than when you go in directly, whereby you fall asleep, you start dreaming, you are non-self-reflectively aware per se, the volume switch gradually increases, you reach the threshold, bang, you realize you're having a lucid dream, and off you go from there. The texture of that lucid dream versus the lucid dream you get into by approaching from the waking state directly into the lucid dream state, they're very different lucid dreams. The one you approach from the waking state directly into the dream state, where you never lose self-reflective awareness, is much more rigid, and that's consistent with the theory. The theory's right. I'm fucking telling you.
Okay, how far would you have to go with this? You, in terms of philosophy of mind, material consciousness, what is it? Are you kind of saying an idealism that it's just all consciousness, or are you saying actually there's kind of like there's a material world, there's physics which governs it, but that physics is variable and depends on consciousness?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's an either or answer. I think it is very much of, I think that we can't separate. I mean, what's what physics is saying right now is we can't separate consciousness from material. One implies the other, and certainly that's the only way you can look at it. You can't have an experience of material without somebody to experience it, and of course you can't actually have an experience unless you are something. So you have to be material to have an experience of material, and material can only be experienced by somebody who's witnessing it. So they both imply each other, really.
So,
Buddhists.
are atoms made of dreams?
Well, yes, they are, is the answer.
Dreams
Yeah, because that's the question. So are they made of, well, are dreams made of atoms?
But are atoms made of dreams?
Yeah. Sorry, yes, pull that one on me. Well, yes, that's the point. They are. Yes, either one. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess, okay. Yeah, go on.
Good question. So when you say
She's running the show now, I'm off. I'll see you down.
So when you say that you have to have body to experience something, so what about remote viewing? When you remote view an object and you experience all the surroundings and you experience the object itself, how would you that place in your
Yeah, it's a good question. So you're kind of stepping into something rather peculiar now. So what I say, we have two things to consider here. Number one is the individual's experience. We can all experience states of magic individually. There's no question about that. If you don't believe me, let me introduce my friend DMT, and you will be convinced that it is possible for anybody to have a magical experience. So, in an individual sense, we can all have that. Now we have to get into something a little more difficult to contend with, which is the question of something like, can we have a consensual experience of something that we ordinarily consider magical?
Can you meet up in your dreams?
Can you meet other people in your dreams, for example? That's the question I've been asking for a long time. On my website, there's a live experiment to try to investigate that. And what we said, a bit like your remote viewing question, I'll try and get it this way. We have a system basically saying on the last Saturday of every month, the lucid dreamers have already typed in their passwords on a kind of an embedded system, a coded system basically. So you type in your password, then you go into the dream world on the last Saturday of every month, you try to meet another lucid dreamer, you try to give them your password and tell them go onto the website and type the password in. It then prompts you to tell you to interact with them. You interact anonymously and try and verify the details and see if anybody could actually exchange passwords. Because there's a lot of people talking about the fact that I meet my friends in lucid dreams and we all hang out. And the honest answer, I set up the experiment not to prove that it was possible, but in many ways to prove that it wasn't possible. I'm such a fucking cynic. But because I don't know, I'm a magician as well, incidentally. And when I say magician, I don't mean a magician like I do lucid dream magic. But I'm also a sleight of hand magician. I studied magic for years, and I've seen some amazing psychics in the magic scene. But they won't tell you they're not psychics, but they will convince you that they are psychic. And the more they tell you they're not psychic, the more convinced you'll be they're psychic. Darren Brown is a classic example. He's incredible. And his live show, forget the TV, his live show will blow your fucking socks off. But he's a magician. He's a very cynical man in his own way, So I guess what I'm saying is I'm still waiting for proof of a consensual. My model doesn't rule it out, incidentally. My model allows it to take place. And the best example, it's in the book, but the example I gave was ayahuasca. With ayahuasca, as an example, you get something called synesthesia, whereby you dilute your various senses so you can see sounds, for example. So theoretically, you can see sounds in this synesthetic experience. This is biologically consistent with our own model of reality. This is not anything out of the ordinary. We know synesthesia exists. It exists in very ordinary people. People's senses get mixed up. They can smell colors. They can hear sounds. And hear sounds? That's fucking wrong. They can hear colors. And yeah, motherfuckers. So you get the idea. So in shamanism, one of the roles of the shaman is to sing the icaros, the songs, the music, and the music becomes the vision of the group. So theoretically, if we were all taking ayahuasca, for example, and we get the shaman playing the shaman's music, theoretically, we could all be experiencing a group vision of the same thing. But to anybody looking on the outside, they wouldn't see anything we're seeing. So we're having a consensual experience of altered reality that is not consistent with the four-dimensional perspective of this person right here. So we are actually having a consensual experience of altered state of consciousness. Does that kind of make sense what I'm saying? And that's the closest I could get to the remote viewing question, because I approached the question of the out-of-body experience in the book, and the particular part of the question of the out-of-body experience I asked was, is there a remote viewing aspect to out-of-body experiences? Because everything else in the out-of-body experience fits with my experience, because I've had out-of-body experiences, and my reality, and my model, and everything else. The only thing I couldn't answer was, is it possible to remote view from an out-of-body experience, and do we have proof of that? The jury's still out. I spoke to Penny Satori, if any of you guys know her, she's the near-death experience expert. She's on my podcast somewhere, and I got into the same question. Penny was the one that was putting the pictures above the beds, so if the patient had an out-of-body experience, they could go up and look at it. If they had she's a nurse, she's got a PhD, she was literally studying. She has no example of it, neither have I. I think it's possible, but I think it's possible the same way that the ayahuasca thing is possible. I think we need to look at it that way, so it's not, I think it's early days.
Can I ask this question then? So, how many people here have had kind of shared dream experiences where they've had a dream and they've met other people and they had the same dream? Okay, it's not.
Yeah, well, I won't lie, I actually had an ayahuasca experience once where definitely I had a full-on conversation with the two shamans, no question about it, but again, it's a bit like I said, like for those of us who were involved with it, definitely it was real, but I wonder if we could somehow prove that to anybody outside of our group. The answer is, I think we'd be able to do it at some point, and I think the answer will probably come with psychedelics. What I anticipate is two guys at two ends of a laboratory, a cement wall between them, both of them tripping out of their brains, one of them being given a piece of information and the other receiving it, and somebody else in the middle recording it. Job fucking done. But the problem is, we got a corrupt government who say that these things are dangerous because they're a bunch of idiots and we can't do it. And that's the facts.
Give me the funding, I'll do it.
Fucking don't make me do it. Seriously, I mean, it's dangerous. That's the point. That's what we need. You know?
Oh my God, you need it. You're in trouble. You really are in trouble now. Any question there?
Well, two things. Just in terms of evidence, I think the Monroe Institute has done it. Yeah, I think in terms of evidence, the Monroe Institute has done it in terms of out-of-body experiences. They've got a huge database of recorded instances of people meeting, of information being transferred. So the experiment, from their perspective, is job done.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people will say about, that it has been done. I'd probably give it to Dave as the answer. David, you would be more qualified to answer that question. What's the evidence say from your point of view?
I'll tell you, there was 3 big studies on remote viewing, one of which was kind of funded by the DIA, Defence Intelligence Agency, for 20 years, and that was found to be successful. And when they reviewed it, one of the reviewers was sceptical and says, well, yeah, the results are significant, but this is just one study, we need independent replication. And there's been 2 other big studies being done since then. They're both also significant, so it looks like the evidence is there.
Good enough for me. My model doesn't contradict it at all. I just have my own way of kind of getting it, but it's a very important question.
Can I just make a point on that, which is to say, in respect to those kinds of things, that if it is possible, then surely it would be easily replicable. It's like claims for UFOs or whatever, yeah? It only takes one photo. Well, where is that bloody photo? Do you know what I'm saying? It's a theory in search of evidence.
I'm kind of on the same page. I'm on the same page as you.
To emphasise the point, yeah. People are claiming they can do it. Well, let it all show us.
I'm on the same page, unfortunately. As I said, my model says that within our own experiences we can have UFO encounters. I've had one myself. I'd just like to show somebody the marks, but there were no marks. But it doesn't mean to say it didn't happen. I'm a UFO abusee. I'm sharing something.
I'll show this one to
I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm reasonably an expert in other mental states. Would you like to comment on what the relationship of lucid dreaming is to some of those other mental states?
Yeah, absolutely. The book certainly asks the exact same question. So I talk about schizophrenia specifically in the book. I was looking at J. Allen Hobson's model. I presume you're familiar with his work. He's a neurobiologist from Harvard. He's very much the father of our current model of, the biological model of dreaming at least. And he talks about dreaming as mental deficiency syndrome, which is very like schizophrenia, but it lacks a certain quality, which is the kind of emotional thrust that a schizophrenic has. We don't necessarily have that in the dreaming experience. But what Hobson does in his own book, which is a fantastic book, The Chemistry of Conscious States, is he models somebody's dream. His patient's name is Delia, or his friend. So he calls it Delia's dream. And he basically takes Delia's dream and he looks at it and he performs what's called a mental status exam. So that's just something we perform in psychiatry when we want to determine the nature of somebody's their mental orientation. Or even as a dentist or some like a cop or a fireman, if they want to know if somebody's okay, they'll say, okay, what's your name? What date is it? Who's the president of America? What's the capital of Paris? If the person can't answer those kind of simple questions, they're probably disoriented. Doesn't mean you give them over to a mental asylum, but you at least think, well, the person's not quite functioning here. We need to figure it further out. A full mental status exam is when you sit down and you start to look at various things like speech patterns, you start to look at thought patterns, you start to kind of dig deeper into the psyche, and you can address the person then and think, okay, well, we have a genuine case here, somebody who's mentally incompetent in some way. So what Hobson does is he looks at Delia and says, I'm going to apply a mental status exam to Delia, and I'm going to determine the nature of her mind. And he describes her as psychotic, that she is basically suffering from acute nocturnal psychosis, which is what he describes dreaming as. So he has a very clever chapter for the very, very clever name for the chapter, Insane in the Brain. Because he's cool. So what Hobson says basically is that when we're dreaming, we're suffering from mental deficiency syndrome. Now I concur with that. So the question Hobson asks is, why does the brain have to go insane every night for a few hours? What's the biological advantage of that? Now, I get into that in the book, and I get into my own meta theory of that, and it gets a bit too far out there. I don't want to get into that, but I do want to get back to the schizophrenic question. Hobson says that he falls short of the schizophrenic diagnosis because Delia doesn't exhibit this kind of emotional anxiety you get in schizophrenia. But Terence McKenna does pick up that when he talks about shamanic ecstasy. So what McKenna says is that when the shaman enters his trance, his psychedelic trance, that the shaman enters into a kind of ecstasy. So he talks about that as being more akin to the schizophrenic, so to speak. So Hobson brings us up into the kind of mental deficiency syndrome, and then McKenna says, no, the emotional part is there. It might not be there in dreaming, but it is in psychedelics. And the model does straddle psychedelics, schizophrenia, hypnosis, etc. They're all allowed by the model. But specifically, McKenna brings in the emotional anxiety with the shaman.
I don't know which shamans he's been hanging out with, because the shamans I know just kind of sitting there scratching their balls and smoking cigarettes in the middle of a ceremony. But not all necessarily in a kind of deep emotional state.
No, I kind of agree. I mean, I'll quote McKenna. I'm just paraphrasing when he says that the schizophrenic and the shaman swim in the same water, but the shaman has thousands and thousands of years of practice and knows how to swim home. Something along those lines. And he talks a lot about shamanism and schizophrenia, and I give him the floor to talk about that in the book. But for my own 10 cents, having kind of had my drink spiked a few times and had shamanic experiences. Is there such a thing as this kind of ecstasy? Oh yeah, you get that, don't you?
I guess it does. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an emotional content to the psychedelic experience, but it needn't necessarily be like that for a shaman. I think they can often be quite restrained.
I think they're very much restrained, to be honest. Yeah.
Often it's like having it under control.
Probably more so than I guess for the kind of psychedelic venture in that regard. I mean, for the shaman, I'm with you. The shaman is normally very centered, but for I suppose those who are participating in the ceremony, there's a lot of tears, or in the case of mushrooms, a lot of laughter, or in some cases there is that full kind of like belching of orgasmic energy that just comes out of your body. It's just incredible waves of energy and just pure bliss that pours out of you if you get that. So I think that kind of Does that answer that question?
Is it, I'm going to carry on from that. Is it like a bit of a disjunction though, or is it, psychedelic experience not quite the same as a lucid dream experience? I mean, like Jace Calloway put forward this idea actually that what's happening in the brain when we're dreaming is based on this idea that your pineal gland supposedly makes DMT. During REM sleep, you have a kind of flush of DMT around the brain, and that's what we call dreaming, REM dreaming anyway. I mean, that's one theory, but are psychedelic experiences necessarily the same as dream experiences?
Yeah, again, I think it's kind of what Anna said really. It's basically, you're meeting in the same place in the centre, which is to say that with the psychedelic experience, although you're approaching from the self-reflective state and you're dulling down the self-reflective awareness into this kind of quantum-like magic state, in the dream state normally you're going the opposite direction from the kind of more non-reflective, non-sense of self, and you're turning the volume up and reaching the centre place. In terms of, if you actually look at the brain activity specifically, what happens when you have a lucid dream is the parts of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the precuneus, I'm not going to go into the biology, but basically the parts of the brain that normally turn on during self-reflective awareness, they're normally switched off when you're dreaming. When you have a lucid dream, they switch on. So we had Michael Chich, I'm pronouncing the name wrong, but in the Max Planck Institute, if you look it up, you'll find it. Basically, the headline will be scientists in the Max Planck Institute find the seat of self-conscious awareness. They found the seat of the self, basically. And they're showing the parts of the brain that light up the moment the person becomes lucid in a dream. So they got lucid dreamers under a CAT scan, and they said, okay, this person is now asleep, this person is dreaming, he's just become lucid, because we've just seen a part of the brain switch on. And at that point, the dreamer is communicating back to the lab, by the way, I'm aware in the dream. They add up all the pieces of the puzzle, and what they're saying is, when the person became lucid, this part of the brain switched on. Now, with psychedelics, with David Nutt, they had a similar experiment. They had an MEG, they had the various, examining the brain. What they discovered was when the person enters into the psychedelic state, the sense of self switches off. But what you're actually getting in both states is a kind of a hybrid state, whereby the sense of self is half on and half off. And in that state, as my model says, you're now in a state where the physics is not quite quantum, it's not quite four-dimensional, and you're in a kind of magic state.
How much of that magic can bleed over into kind of fully conscious waking reality?
Yeah, it does, is the answer, yes. I mean, more and more it does. Your reality starts to become a little bit diluted, at which point you start to question your own sanity. And perhaps you are actually going fucking insane. And that's a real concern too. I mean, I certainly talk about that in the book, in my opening chapter, saying there is a real risk of psychosis. Don't read beyond this chapter if you're not comfortable. All the cool kids will read past that, of course, so I know that's you. There's no question. Like you're playing with reality. You're playing with your mind, because that's what you're questioning. The deepest ontological question you're asking is, what's my reality? Do you see things happening in your world and becoming a little bit different? I think you see more synchronicity. You start to see more things just happening. You become like a Jedi Knight. You feel the Force. You really do.
Were you at all influenced by Don Juan books, Carlos Castaneda? Because in the first few books he talks a lot about lucid dreaming as a kind of means to kind of magic.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't think I quite gelled. I did read them, I never quite gelled with his narrative style or something. And they're well written and good. I never got them. McKenna influenced me mostly.
Sounds more like it. So I have a kind of query. What's it all good for? I mean, I've got an idea. I'll try and answer my own question there. And the theory is that altered states seem to be kind of critical, perhaps, as kind of for cultural evolution. In that, if you take these ideas, okay, kind of like cave art, Neolithic, kind of Paleolithic cave art, Paleolithic. In that, it seems like these were generated through altered states of consciousness. They supposedly map these kind of geometric, ontoptic patterns you see in altered states. So that was kind of the first sign of the birth of culture, was kind of cave art in a way, rock art. And then you kind of had McKenna's ideas, possibly hugely speculative about the stoned ape hypothesis that psychedelics or some altered state was able to kind of induce this synesthesia, which gave birth to language, because we were able to kind of see the sounds and therefore kind of name things with kind of utterances. And then you kind of fast forwarding kind of rapidly, then you've got kind of Mendeleev discovering the periodic table in a dream. Then you've got Kekule discovering the benzene ring in a dream. Then you've got Crick, possibly under the influence of LSD. You've got Carrie Mullis discovering polymerase chain reaction, which we would not have, Human Genome Project and what we know about DNA without Carrie Mullis. So you've got oodles of these examples, Niels Bohr, Einstein, the list goes on. I forgot what the question was. So, is it kind of altered states of consciousness? Are these kind of critical or useful for these kind of discoveries, for these kind of great inventions?
Yeah. That kind of brings the theory to kind of the more, how to say, the more metaphysical end of the spectrum. And there's what's it all good for? I think. Well, yeah, I'm with you. What's it all good for? The answer actually for me is cosmic evolution. See, very simple. And McKenna talks about this too. I give McKenna this. He talks about two forces in the cosmos. He talks about novelty, which is kind of repetitive behavior, the same thing repeating itself over and over again, and then this kind of chaos. I think he calls it novelty and habit. So habit is the same thing happening over and over again, and novelty is something new coming to the system. So why would you have that? Well, the answer very simply is if I gave you a square of glass, we'll say, for example, and I said, how many shapes can you see there? So I can see one shape, a square, and I watch this. Smash the glass. And how many shapes can you see? So the whole fucking load of shapes going on now. So the point of the matter is that when you break something up and you put it back together again, you come up with a different way of looking at it. And that's what the cosmos is doing, is breaking itself up and putting itself back together again, and breaking itself up and putting itself back together again. So you have this kind of progression of novelty, of habit and chaos. And what dreaming does specifically on a very acute biological level, this is my theory of dreaming at least, and I'm going to own this motherfucking theory so nobody else has this one. Why do we dream? That's the question. Well, for me, the reason we dream is basically because it is what I call it's called a pattern interrupting device. Our normal habitual patterns, when our self-reflective awareness is switched off for a few hours every night, when our sense of self is switched off for a few hours every night, we start to engage in novel pattern type behavior. Because we're not being self-reflectively aware, we're not being self-conscious, we're not saying, oh, I can't do this, I can't say this, I can't have this, I can't do that. There's nothing blocking that. You just do whatever you want to do. So what that's doing is it's basically interrupting your behavior patterns, which then bleeds over into your waking state and changes your social behavior in this state. And what that does is it actually changes the ecological, sociological system. It basically means that the entire ecological system is, because of the fact that the behavior patterns are being disrupted and being put back together in slightly different ways, it changes the interaction of the environment. So what that basically does is it has an evolutionary advantage, because we know in nature it's survival of the most adaptable. And the most adaptable organisms are the organisms that don't repeat the same behavior over and over and over to their detriment. The organisms that survive are the organisms that do something different. So when a climate changes, they do something different, they adapt, they're constantly changing. So by dreaming, we're breaking up our sense of self, our behavior patterns, our social patterns, and that's the reason we dream, basically. And then on a meta-cosmological scale, by us humans becoming more complex, which of course we are, the universe itself is now experiencing itself in a more complex way through our interpretation of it. So by the universe, through dreaming, we become more complex, and by us becoming more complex, the universe becomes more complex. And by the universe becoming more complex, this conversation becomes more complex. And all this fucking nonsense.
Let's make it a bit more complex and have some people from the audience. There's a question here. Sorry, come back to you.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you've ever had an encounter with a dream as premonition.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, just the once, and not premonition, more so. I had somebody who was, and I'll be really brief, and I'm not going to pretend to have a lot of experiences. Somebody was coming over to my house once, and I was able to see their experience. She came over to my house drunk, and I had a dream. I was her having all that experience, and then the doorbell rang. She was down there, and I knew exactly where she'd been, to the bus, sitting on the bus, in the back of the taxi. I had experienced all of her reality. Right until she came. So just the once, but it was, to this day, I hold it up there with one of the most bizarre and provocative experiences I've had. And again, it's my reality. I don't know, but I've experienced that. So, but that's as close as.
Did you wake up with a hangover?
Shit, I didn't think of that. Good one.
No. Any more questions on the floor? Oh, sorry, go on. Susanna, and then one at the back.
Not exactly a question, but this area of dreaming stuff. Some 30 odd years ago, I was a mother of 3 children under 7. I had previously done quite a bit of tripping and peyote and lived in America a lot. And in my dream, I was in in reality, I was on the 12th floor of a tower block in Tottenham, around the time of Broadwater Farm, if anyone. So heavy, urban vibe. In my dream, I was in California, where I had lived several times, and I was on the beach, and somebody came along, as they do, and gave me some acid. So I took this acid, and I was happily tripping on the beach in the sunshine, and I woke up, I was in the tower block in Tottenham, and I was tripping for the rest of the day, with no after effects, no residuals from tripping, but I couldn't eat anything. I carried on the normal day, went and got the kids from school, looked after the toddler, all of it in the 12th floor of a tower block in Tottenham, which was extremely weird, and it's one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had. But that one where, as you say, that you're somewhere in between both.
Oh yeah.
Because I only dreamt that I took the acid, that I had the full effect of tripping.
Well, McKenna talked about that in one of his lectures. He talked about the fact that he smoked DMT in his dream and actually had a DMT experience.
Same. And I've never heard anyone else.
And I've had an acid experience in a dream.
Okay.
So you're not alone.
Good.
We can share.
Very good.
I've had one. I talked for another lecture another time, but I definitely
yeah.
have, and it does exist.
But it's very profound.
It
because
totally works.
it completely changes your...
Dream acid is good and it's cheap. And it's legal.
And you get no residuals, as I said.
And there's no come down.
I was just going to say, you were saying that dreams are kind of our way of breaking up reality. So is there something to be said about just allowing them to happen rather than trying to control them as we do our everyday life?
Yeah, I think that pretty much that's exactly what to do. I mean, you know, sometimes people confuse the idea of lucid dreaming as me being some sort of control freak who goes into my dreams and wrestles them into submission every night. I treat lucid dreaming as an occasional venture when I want to get a piece of information, like taking psychedelics. It's an occasional venture. You know, it's for the most part, just let the dreaming mind do what it needs to do. It has a job. Its job is to basically break up your bullshit ideas, break up your view of reality, so you go out the next day and have a different experience, and you have a different conversation with a different person about something completely different. And that's nature's way of progressing. So yeah, let it take its own course, certainly.
Yeah, just a quick question about electrical stimulation being used to switch lucid dreaming on.
Is this going to be clean?
You tell me. Basically, yeah, that idea that we'll have devices that will allow us to reliably turn lucid dreaming on, what are the implications for society? I mean, I imagine there's this space opening up where we could, you know, potentially do more work or be forced to work in our lucid states as well as in the real state. So what are the implications for society?
Yeah, that's a big question when you just put it like that right there. I hadn't even thought of that, to be honest with you. I never thought about, you know, what could be the real implications of that. It's inevitable that we're going to be able to switch dreams on and off, and I think in the same way you can switch dreams on and off, you'll be able to switch on and off the same cellular system that switches on self-reflective awareness. So the only question time before you literally can switch lucid dreams on and off. So that's the only answer I can give to that question. The implications of that, too fucking vast. I don't even know where to start with that.
More presence, probably. John?
But it's a really good question, by the way. I just think it's just too big and too heavy, but we're going to chat afterwards.
Just an interesting observation. I've had quite a lot of lucid dreams over the past. Quite often I've tried to look at wording in lucid dreams, pick up newspapers and read them. I can never quite make out words. You might pick out odd words, but you can never pick out structured sentence. It's quite fascinating. I've been stuck really trying to read in the lucid dream. I've never been able to do it, but odd words pop out, like signs above shops and things.
Well, like you know, it's a kind of a classic feature of lucid dreaming, is that. But again, this kind of comes back to the idea I was talking about narrative congruency. It kind of stands to reason that something as peculiar as text, which implies a certain kind of a rigid narrative. I mean, you read a book and the story doesn't change. Maybe there's some sort of a metaphorical inference right there.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, I never thought that way before, but yeah, we put it like that.
On the more mystical side, the one that I have had quite a lot is precognitive type experiences. I'll have something come up in a dream, and literally after I wake up, mostly very mundane things, like that image will pop up in the telly, on the radio, that's happened. I was very sceptical about precognition, but it's dented my own scepticism, my own experience actually. I've had it so many times, you know, from dreaming, lucid dreaming. So that's
yeah.
Any more questions? Oh, there's one here, Emma.
Have you experienced, I'm sure you have, dream walkers, like people or sorcerers who can walk into your dreams and say maybe manipulate your dream? And if you were in that situation, how do you kind of steer your consciousness back if, for example, you didn't want the dream walker to manipulate your dream?
I wouldn't say about anybody who was malevolent per se, but I've certainly had. I'll probably give you a better example, and I'll be quick with that, I promise, but it is funny. Somebody spiked my drink recently and gave me ayahuasca. And
Keep doing that.
And it's a terrible thing. I hang in all the wrong social circles. And they also gave me something else, which was an essence of nettle, because they say, you know, you're the dream warrior, you've got to take nettle and meet the dream, because the nettle is the warrior plant. And I'm up for anything at this stage. I'm fine, do it. So I'm certainly entering the kind of hyperdimensional space. My sense of self has been gradually disassembled. I'm sitting there, everything's been dissolved, and I'm pretty much just in that state of, all right, I'm kind of good for anything now. And for those of you who have had ayahuasca, there tends to be this sense of a female presence, which would be kind of like what you're talking about. There's a sense of an entity, a female being, but she doesn't come across as malevolent. She's usually a helper, and I'm sure you all know this yourselves. But if you don't, there's a sense of a female presence in the ayahuasca experience. She comes in, she has a conversation with you about, you know, stuff, this kind of cosmic counseling about the nature of yourself and so on. So I'm sitting there, so I kind of reach out in my mind, and you speak in your mind in the DMT experience. So I speak out to her, I say, so are you there? And the next thing I see is this green, spiky, snaky thing fly across the screen, and it says to me, these are the words exactly, she's not here, I am. To which I went, metal? Fucking shut up. And to this day, I just think it's just the most. And me and Neville, we had a conversation, and it was like full on. I said, "I'm going to take you to her." I'm like, "Okay." You know, it wasn't even good to argue with them. But that's a classic example. I was not expecting. I mean, like I said, I'm, believe it or not, quite cynical about a lot of this stuff. But when that showed up, I was just killing myself laughing. Oh no, he had a very particular presence. It was male, it was handsome, it was funny, it was a real kind of cavalier type. It was into fencing and nothing would get near me with it. It just transmitted so much information about itself in an instant, and I immediately, any sense of resistance I had to the experience just went, I'm okay now, I'll just go with you over here. And he took me to this female thing, says, I'm out of here now, and he fucked off and she stepped in, and you know.
Your question here. Well, last question, I think. Maybe.
How do you feel that lucid dreaming relates to sleep paralysis? Because I've had both in sort of equal amounts, and like you say, with lucid dreaming, you kind of tiptoe into the less sort of cognitive area, whereas sleep paralysis kind of drops you straight into shit and it's all kind of mad.
Yeah. So just for those of you who are not aware, sleep paralysis basically is due to the fact that in the same thing that Dave was posting about the medulla, basically switching dreams on, it also switches the physical body as we know it off. So there's a kind of an upward signal to the brain saying, go do your crazy stuff, and there's a downward signal to the body saying, you don't listen to that guy upstairs. So it basically saturates the spine with electrical activity and dulls any kind of information getting from the brain to the body. So whatever you're doing in your dream, you're not going to get out of your bed and do something stupid. But sometimes those signals get a bit mixed up. So the signal to the body is in body shut down, gets sent, but the signal to the brain, hey, brain start dreaming, doesn't quite get sent. So the person's still awake and they can still feel themselves, but they can't move their body. And sometimes what happens in that state is that the dreaming brain is kind of half switched on, half switched off. So you get a kind of a bleeding over of the dreaming state into the waking state. You get a kind of a hybrid state, which is a bit like what I hypothesize schizophrenia is. It's the dreaming brain leaking into the waking state. You get this hybrid state of consciousness. So it is still on, within my model, it's on the spectrum. So whether you're having a lucid dream, schizophrenia, sleep paralysis with bleeding images into the waking state, or whether it's psychedelics with images bleeding into the waking state, it's all on the spectrum. It's all about where your sense of self is kind of turned on or turned off, and how much of it, you've got 1 foot in the 4-dimensional world and 1 foot in the quantum world. And the question is how you straddle in that, and how you straddle it is usually down to your sense of self.
I've got a question coming on from that about kind of putting either quantum or Newtonian physics, and this is to do with. Okay, so this is my problem. So lucid dream state, I got to the point where I'm flying in my dreams a lot. Lucid dream, I figured, right, in the dream, what would happen is I'd have a flying dream, and then I'd go and show everybody around the house I was flying, and they'd be like, oh yeah, he's just, he's always doing that, and they just ignore me. So I figured, in a lucid dream, if I could actually wake up whilst I was dreaming, yeah, as I was flying, I would be flying when I was awake, and then I could really show off, basically. So I had this thing where I had a lucid dream, I was like, oh yeah, I'm flying, now what I've got to do is wake up now, prise my eyes open, and sure enough, I found myself flying above my bed in my bedroom.
Oh wow.
Corridor, went to over in the kitchen, and he just carried on ignoring me. He's like, oh, anyone want a cup of tea? Just ignore him, kind of thing. And then, of course, then I woke up. So my question is, how do I actually get to fly? How do I bring the quantum physics into the Newtonian?
So how I see that basically is, we can have a subjective experience of the quantum type physics, the quantum-like physical type of reality. We can have a subjective experience of that. We have it every night anyway. Go into your dream state, you're already having all those things of being here and there at the same time, time gets mixed up, you're this and that, and you're this. So all those, whatever, read up, if you don't know your quantum physics, look at quantum physics and all the weirdness, think about it as a dream, it doesn't seem so weird anymore, so you already do it. So you can have a subjective experience of it. It's how we have a consensual experience of that, that's the question. And as I said, the furthest I can get that at the moment is the ayahuasca example, whereby the group are all taking the ayahuasca, and if we were all taking ayahuasca right now, it's possible David could fly, and we could all experience that, but anybody looking in here would think we're a bunch of mad people. But I think shamans can do that, for example. I think shamans could demonstrate magical powers to a group as long as you had already kind of switched your sense of consciousness from the classical 4-dimensional causal state into that quasi-quantum, semi-critical type state that I'm talking about, that hyperstate consciousness. If you were already in that state, I think you could. But also I think that there's room for that with these kind of tribal folk who wouldn't necessarily have taken anything, but could still enter into group hallucinations as long as it's culturally consistent within their narrative, if that makes sense. I think you can take the model into that area as well. There's a book called There Be Snakes. Have you read that book?
No.
No, it's about a guy who's down the Amazon forest, and I'll give you the upshot of it very quickly. He's in the Amazon forest, and he's a linguist, and he's down to interpret some kind of very, very exotic language in the deep Amazon with some local tribe folk. And they all run down to the beach, and they're all pointing at something on the beach, and he goes down, and they're all going, and he's like, oh yeah, what the fuck? And eventually he realizes they're pointing at some sort of a being on the beach. And he kind of goes along with it and kind of goes, oh yeah, there's a being on the beach. And eventually kind of goes, I better break the code of silence here. Well, obviously there isn't a being on the beach, we're just going along with it. And he says, no, they can all see it. And he can't see it. And he's like, whoa, but they can all see it and I can't see it? How the fuck is that happening? That's the opening chapter of the book. The rest of it's shit. It really sells you a great start. You're like, this is going to blow my fucking mind. The rest was just this bullshit about him. And when you go into it. But the punchline of it is something to do with language and to do with a kind of a group cultural belief that if we have a kind of a consensual cultural system that's narratively congruent within the proximity of each other, then it can accommodate that kind of group hallucination, which to the outside world wouldn't, if that makes sense. So when you hear about these people like in parts of the world where you have these yogis who can teleport and put fire on their hands and float and so on, and their students have all seen it, but we're all like, well, you're all just talking shit. But to the students it's real. There's a place for that. There's a place for that.
Is it like a kind of collective belief and perception which kind of somehow ties into the whole kind of state of consciousness, you know, but it's like it's a cultural thing as well. I mean, we don't live in a magical reality.
No, we don't.
Here,
No, that's the point. We don't. You just said it right there. We don't. You know, but if we all believe David can fly together,
I'm going to fly out to the corner and get this one last question, and then we'll probably wrap it up. Actually, here we go. Did you see that? Almost took off.
The joke's a landing, son.
Hi, what you were saying was just made me think of the double slit experiment, which shows that quantum states are influenced by consciousness, because when an experimenter watches the double slit experiment, the outcome changes. So the consciousness, awareness, actually affects the location of particles in this experiment, and it's been replicated millions of times, so we know it's true. So how that relates to this idea of like a consensual reality, what you were saying about in certain cultures there being, or when you take it in certain mental states, you can have a kind of group psychosis or group hallucination, or possibly group reality, and made me think that perhaps that's how covens work.
That's how covens, pardon me?
Witches' covens, I imagine.
Oh, witches' covens, pardon me, sorry, I wasn't familiar. Yes is the answer. I mean, that would be the most logical answer to me, is that the term I use, it's not, is narrative congruency. Whatever is narratively congruent to your particular cultural heritage will effectively become your reality. And I think, therefore, what we're living in, whether we want to admit it or not, is actually just, it's a story, it's a cultural paradigm we've created that we confuse for reality. But once we start to play with the magical dimensions, that becomes a little bit more evident, and we can start to play with it and change the story.
What a brilliant way of wrapping up. So, what we'll do is we're going to thank Rory in a second for a brilliant delivery there and a great, good old chin wag. Meanwhile, to get a copy of his amazing book, The Paradox of Lucid Dreaming, and there's a whole bunch of other books at the back from kind of we put out from various events and such as Breaking Convention and whatnot. Do have a look at those. Meanwhile, then we can go downstairs, have a glass of wine, you can join us for dinner, and join us in some other kind of random alternative consensual reality. Meanwhile, let's give Rory a brilliant round of applause for it.
Just to say, I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen, and Dave for the opportunity to bring me here, so thanks again.